Excellent storytelling, Black characters, liberation themes, and female authors. All of this and more for the Telling Our Stories Black Female Authors series. It's Women's History Month, and we are here for it. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report.
My first guest is USA Today best-selling novelist Beverly Jenkins. From romance novels to historical romance trilogies, Beverly has written over 40 books over 2 decades. She is the undisputed queen of the Black 19th century romance novel. She is back to discuss her latest book, Wild Rain. It's the second novel in her Women Who Dare series. Welcome back, Beverly. When you were last here, you were putting the finishing touches on Wild Rain. It came out in February, Black History Month, and I know it's already gotten a ton of 5-star reviews. It's been incredibly well received. So tell me, what does it feel like to have your, I don't know if this is your 41st book or you're well into double digits. So what's the feeling been like with the reception of Wild Rain?
It's been great. You're always pleased when the readers enjoy your book. It's a different kind of a book sort of for me, but with the heroine as a woman who didn't want children. So, sometimes that demographic in romance is not served. So I got lots of positive feedback from women who were saying, oh, I held my breath at the end of the book to make sure she wasn't going to change her mind and, and all of that. But, we all deserve HEAs, happily ever after. And if a woman decides that she is enough or she and her partner are enough, then they deserve an HEA too. So this book is dedicated to them.
Well, I have to tell you, I was never a big romance novelist fan until I got turned on to you. And I bought the book, of course. I wanted to make sure I read it from cover to cover before this interview. And it is, man, I was like, these are some steamy situations Miss Spring and Mr. Garrett are involved in. I guess I was naive about how sexual and sensual romance novels can be. And I've seen Bridgerton, so I've seen it on screen, but this was my first introduction, and I have to tell you, I like this book.
Welcome to the family. And it's, some of, my stuff is considered kind of mild.
Okay, so there's some writers that go even further than what you do, and
oh yeah. We have it's one of the components, but it's not the main component in the story. I think the scenes are very, very necessary to the story. But yeah, there are women out here who are writing pretty steamy stuff. And then you also have what we call sweet romance, where there are no love scenes at all.
Oh, okay.
So, it depends on, what you want in your story. And, we're the largest selling part of mass market fiction. Romance brought probably $1.3 billion to the table last year.
Wow, so it's a huge industry.
It's a huge industry. And, and it used to be all women. So we're all like independent, sole book business owners.
Right.
But it's expanded now to reflect more of the country. So you have queer romances, you have trans romances, you have romances written by guys now.
Wow.
We have male, we have female. So it's starting to reflect the country. But like I said, it is the largest selling piece of the cake.
Well, I'm so glad that you are in it, and not just in it, but that you are a queen in this genre. I want to get back, though, to Wild Rain, because it's been called a boldly feminist novel, primarily because the main character, Spring, really defies societal norms. As you said, she doesn't want to have kids. She doesn't want to get married. She runs her own horse ranch in Wyoming, and she is fiercely independent.
Yeah.
Who is there someone that serves as the inspiration for spring for you?
Just the women of the African American women of the 19th century. And I don't know if we talked about this last time or not, but Dorothy Sterling has a book. She's a historian. She's a book called We Are Your Sisters, Black Women of the 19th Century. And it sort of was my Bible with a little b when I started. And she said Black women had 3 gifts that helped them be successful in the 19th century, because, we were some of the first doctors. We were some of the first, Maggie Lena Walker was the first woman, let alone Black woman, to start a bank in Richmond, Virginia. So she said they had 3 gifts. And one was we worked, whether we were enslaved or free.
Right.
We worked. The second gift was the commitment to community and social activism.
Right.
And number 3 was Black women's penchant to push the envelope on gender and race.
Wow. Okay.
So you see a little bit of that, sometimes all 3, in my heroines, in my books. Mm-hmm. And spring is definitely number 3, pushing the envelope on gender and race. So I try.
She works. She works really hard. So she
right.
Too.
Yeah, and she has she's not a real, people person, but, she has a commitment to her family.
Yes.
So, yeah, a little bit of all 3 in spring, too. So.
There's a famous line in the book that I love that Spring says. She says, "I have land and horses. I'm content."
Yeah.
I can just see kind of like a modern day woman, like, I got my house, and my bank account. I'm good. So, I just was interpreting that in modern day talk. But that really kind of sums up, who Miss Spring is. She's got this land that she, is responsible for. She's proud of. And she loves her horses. And, she's like, Garrett, I'm okay.
Yeah, she wasn't, she was not about the love. She was like, nah, I don't really need that. Like you said, I got my land, I got my horses, I'm good. But yeah, she's quite the character.
Yeah, let's talk about her love interest for a minute, Mr. Garrett. We don't give the whole book away, but he is, I read someplace that he's your first cinnamon roll hero.
Yeah.
Help us understand how that term is used by romance writers.
It's a term used by us for guys, because, usually your hero in a romance, he's pretty arrogant, he's got a lot of swagger, he's all that. Until the woman cuts him off at the knees, right? Okay. When he falls in love. But Garrett and cinnamon rolls are sort of the opposite. They may be very, very sweet, no drama. He's kind of nerdy. Every time we see him, he has a book in his hand. The only thing I didn't give him was glasses.
He's a lawyer.
Yeah, he's a lawyer, he's a newspaper guy, and he's a carpenter. And Black people back then had whole lots of hats we had to wear in order to be successful. But, his thing is he's not trying to change her. Right. He enjoys, and he's so fascinated by her. Yes. He enjoys her as she is. He doesn't think she needs to be painted over or planed or, honed or any of that. And his decision to stay with her had quite a interesting. I have a book club meeting with my readers when we have a new book, and it was an interesting conversation. And a lot of people, and I try and make it a safe place so that people can express themselves without being jumped on.
Right.
So you had women who were like, but he wanted the baby because. And she was, and other ladies were like, well, he got on the train. If he didn't want, her, he should have went on home instead of getting off the train. So it's a great story. I had a great time writing it.
No, it's such a good story. And although Spring is like this, epitome of strong, independent woman. There is a point in the book where she's also vulnerable.
Yeah.
Now, she rescued him when he fell off his horse and he's like freezing to death, she takes him in. But there's this moment where he comes to her aid, when she's in this dispute with this white guy. So she's not incapable of recognizing that she needs help, and he's there to provide her with that help. How do you strike that balance between wanting her to be fiercely independent, but showing this vulnerable side of her too?
Yeah. Well, beneath all of that, what I call barbed wire and hard edges of her, is a lot of vulnerability. Mm-hmm. And to have her feel safe enough with him to show that, is how you do that balance. And like she said, yeah, I can fight myself, she said, but sometimes a girl gets tired of fighting by herself.
Yeah, so that was another highlighted phrase for me. To quote you exactly, sometimes the girl gets tired of fighting alone.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, again, speaking to so many African-American women, we're resilient, we're strong, but sometimes we need a little help too. So I love that, you show that side of her.
Yeah, sometimes you just need a shoulder to put your head on, so you can get up the next morning and do what you need to do. But
she's amazing in that way. But I want to ask you though about, you have mastered this art of blending history and fiction and romance. And this story takes place in the wake of the Civil War. Is it fictitious that you would have a lawyer, a reporter, you would have a Black woman who's owning her own ranch, her brother's a doctor, because, as the story goes, Garrett is coming to town to interview Spring's brother, who's the physician. Are Black people, got it going on like that in the wake of the Civil War?
Yeah, I mean, Howard had the first medical school, and it was founded right after the Civil War. We were everywhere, doing everything. And one of the joys of writing what I do is to be able to spread that history around. The first Black newspaper was in Philadelphia in 1827. So, by the 19th century, there were over 500 newspapers in the country. Mm-hmm. And they were very, very fierce about speaking for the race in the face of all the craziness that happened after, Reconstruction was gutted in 1876. So you try and give it to the history to them, to the readers, in a way that is user-friendly. One of my girlfriends calls it edutainment, entertainment and education.
Right.
I give you a bib list in the back. If you look at the older books, when I was really, really setting the base of our history, there are very, very long bibliographies in the backs of each of the books, so that people who wanted to do more research on, say, the Black and brown Indians, the Black and brown lawmen and bandits of Indian Territory could look that up. You look up stuff on the Black Seminoles, because I've written a little bit of everything, a little bit of everything.
Well, what's so interesting is that most books, and I think most people's introduction to that period in our history, is always telling the story of the slave or the slave who now has become free and the struggles of that person. Yet you're telling us the triumphs, the success stories, the brilliance of people during this period. And I know you talked about this a little when you were here before, but for anybody that didn't see that first interview, help us understand how difficult it was for you as a Black writer, wanting to write romance, wanting to write Black historical fiction, and tell those stories of the lawyers, the doctors, the reporters, not just the slave stories.
Yeah, when my agent was shopping my book in '93, because my first book came out in '94, and back then, most of publishing, and probably most of the country, felt that a 19th century story had to do with slavery.
Yeah.
So here I come with a story about, free Black people, Buffalo soldier, Oberlin educated school teacher, because Oberlin was one of the first and only higher institutions that let people, let us get an education outside of grade school. and they're living on the plains of Kansas in an all-black town. And publisher was like, whoa, wait, what, what are we supposed to do with this? They had no idea of the richness of our history, the scope of our history, and the span of our history. Right. I also make a point to highlight Black men because they don't get the respect that they deserve. They've served this country since, the French and Indian War, before we became a country. Civil War, 1812, Afghanistan, Vietnam. Yeah. And in romance, you will find probably one of the only places where Black men are celebrated. So I go out of my way to make them the heroes that they are and that they have been. Yeah. So, like I said, I love what I do. I really do.
And your books are about romance, but they're also, like you said, about these celebrated heroes in our community and in our history. There's also this ethos of Black solidarity and liberation that runs through your books. And so given that, do you think your novels have taken on even a greater importance, given this moment in history where we find ourselves reckoning, with systemic racism following the murder of George Floyd?
Yeah, I think that anytime we can show our humanity, because a lot of times, the country doesn't feel like, we have any. And through these books, they have been embraced for that since 1994. I had a woman who once said, Miss Bev, I love reading your books. She said, because, at the end, I'm not singing old slave, nobody knows, So it's a testament to the historians whose shoulders I stand on. Mm-hmm. And I tell people, any mistakes that you find are mine. They are not the historians. The historians get it right. But I call myself a kitchen table historian. I take all the great books that have been written by Dorothy Sterling and John Hope Franklin and Art Burton, who is the great historian on the Black West. And I put them out on my kitchen table, and and then I put my stories together, standing on their scholarships. So it's a blessing and it's a gift, and I'm very, very grateful to be in this spot at this time in history for the last 27 years writing these books.
Yeah, I got really emotional. I read something that you said about when you were able to do book tours, pre-COVID, you would go out on the road with your books, and you were on a book tour with your book Indigo. Mm-hmm. And how African-American women, particularly dark-skinned African-American women, would come up to you and just cry and express how happy they were to see themselves represented in your book. Because dark-skinned, we know the history of colorism and dark-skinned women, in particular, we're talking about women, men too, but women, in this case, have had in this country. So how important is it to you that you're not only telling our history, you're dealing with some pretty delicate issues that, even get dicey in Black families. We have our own colorism issues.
Right, yeah. Well, I try and make my stories, when I'm dealing with characters and their backstories, as real as possible. You can't have a story about us without Jim Crow, without the colorism, without the people who passed, without the people who gave their lives so that, I could be here doing nothing but writing, love stories. It's very, very important for me to get it right. And it's very, very important to show layers of characters. They're not just walking around doing stuff. Right. They have influences from, life. They have influences from where they live. They have influences from the people that may have owned them. So, you put all of that in a pot and, you throw in stuff and you add the love stories and, you let it cook on the stove and then put it out there for people to consume. So proud of what I do, proud of my readers, proud of you for taking a chance on me and reading the book. So it's all good.
You have enlightened me and opened my eyes. So I started with Wild Rain so I could be prepared for this interview. I wanted to know these characters. I wanted to know this storyline. But for someone like me who didn't know you, 3 months ago, who's watching the show, who is inspired and wants to pick up their first Beverly Jenkins novel, where do they get started? When I went to the bookstore, first off, there's so many Beverly Jenkins novels on the shelves. Like I said, I had a very specific purpose in mind, but for someone who's just getting started, getting introduced to you, what's the first book they should read?
I tell them to start at the beginning, because out of all of I think there's 30 historicals. There's only one book that is not connected to the others. So you start at the beginning with Night Song, which is the very first book. And you go to Vivid, which is the second book, and that's my tribute to the African-American doctors. And then Indigo is book 3. So if you start with Night Song and go through, and then there is a list on my website, both series-wise and publication-wise, because I've never thought about them as series. The readers are like, well, this book is connected. I'm like, no. Start at the beginning, because you miss stuff, and you read, and you're like, oh, this character was in this other book. So if you start with Night Song, which is the very first, and you get all of that history about how these Black people moved out of the South after Reconstruction in the Great Exodus of 1879, which is our first mass exodus out of the South. Not to be confused, like we said last time, with the Great Migration of 1900.
Right.
Those people went north to Chicago and Detroit, and these folks went west, and they founded these little towns in Iowa and Kansas and Nebraska. A history that we're not taught in school about the Black people who lived on the plains. So the most famous city is Nicodemus, Kansas. So I like to put my stories, or I always put my stories where Black people walked, because our history is so rich. I don't have to make this stuff up.
Yeah, no, you really don't. But that's great. So I'm taking a trip in a week, so I'm going to be on the plane with Night Song.
Okay.
It's going to be my reading. So I'm going to go back. I've got a lot of, catching up to do, starting at the beginning. What's next for you, Beverly? You Wild Rain. You're on, I guess, a virtual book tour, because I've seen tons of interviews that you're doing.
I've been everywhere, girl. I have been. February was just a blur. What's next is the third book in this Women Who Dare series. It's due to my editor in September. I have no idea who the third person's going to be. I'm a pants. We got two kinds of writers. We have the plotters and the pantsers. The plotters, they know everything. They got everything written down. They got the outline, all that. Me, no. I'm one of those people that's writing by the seat of my pants. I have no idea. The characters will eventually come up and tap me on the shoulder and say, okay, this is what we're doing. And I'm just trying to keep up, right? But
so are you churning out a book a year, 2 books a year? What's this?
I do 2 books a year. I do a historical, and I do the Blessing series, which is my women's fiction series. About found families and adoption and foster parents, and the setting takes place in Henry Adams, which is the setting for my very first novel. So I also do suspense. So I'm all over the place. So the characters in the Blessing novels and the characters in my romantic suspense are the descendants of the characters in my historicals.
Okay. So they're all interrelated.
It's all interrelated. There's only one book that does not, and that's the Beverly Jenkins trivia question. So, you guys will have to read all the books in order to figure out, because I'm not going to
answer those questions.
Yeah.
When you were here before, Beverly, we talked about your books, some of your titles being optioned. I know you have some deal with Sony. Option, doesn't mean anything until, the deal is inked and the production schedule has been set.
Exactly.
Any further developments with, are we going to see any of these great titles on the screen?
Yeah, we're waiting on COVID to sort of loosen its hold on California so that we can deal with Sony. They have Forbidden, which is a book that sort of starts the arc for Wild Rain. It's like 4 or 5 books back.
Okay.
And then Al Roker has expressed an interest in the Blessing series. We've heard nothing further on that. Just optioned a novella, which is a Christmas story and a historical, because there are absolutely, there's only a handful, maybe I count them on one hand, of Christmas books with Christmas movies with Black people.
Yeah.
So this is a historical. It's called Homecoming if you want to read the novella first.
Okay.
So just did an option on that. So, we're hopeful, but, I'm just going to keep writing, and I figure people catch up with me eventually, and because, we have the content, just, give us a call. So.
Yeah, no, you're right about Christmas movies. I'm a big Christmas movie fan, and I do think this last Christmas we saw Lifetime, we saw OWN, we saw BET, we saw more of the cable channels, which typically run the Christmas movies. We saw more diversity, I think, than I've seen in years, because I've been watching Christmas movies forever.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to hear that maybe I'm going to be watching a Beverly Jenkins.
That would be great.
Christmas movie.
Yeah.
That would be amazing. Just last question for you, Beverly. Any words of encouragement you can give to anyone who's thinking about wanting to write a story, whether it's about their family history or they just want to create beautiful characters like you. So many folks say, I want to write a book, but they don't know how to get started. They just have like writer's cramp, writer's anxiety.
Yeah,
just start.
Get started. Just start, and then learn as much as you can about the business of writing. I always send people to janefriedman.com. She's a big-time editor in New York for many, many years, had her own imprint. And now she's sort of retired, and she's sort of devoting herself to helping people get published. She's got lots of webinars. She's got, write
Jane, say her name again?
Jane Friedman.
Okay.
FRIEDMAN.com.
Okay.
I always send people, you have to do your homework. I have people say, well, I don't want to do all that. Well, you're not going to write a book. I'm giving you the keys to the castle, because there is no magic formula. There's no way to wish yourself into publishing. You have to do the work. Yeah. And don't get discouraged. I got enough rejections for my first book, Night Song, to publish, to paper everybody's kitchen that So you need a thick skin, but the idea that you're actually putting stuff out there to be rejected is the first step, because you've broken through that barrier and you're ready to go. And don't give up. Don't give up. Don't give up. And finish the book.
Yeah. Well, thanks to you, you've broken so many barriers. So the rejections that you got, not to say that people won't get rejected, but I have to imagine that now, in this moment in history where we stand and sit, that publishers are more receptive and more open to Black authors, to Black stories, to Black authors telling stories of Black people.
Yeah.
And it's because, folks like yourself who paved the way. Doesn't mean you're going to get a yes, but it does mean, you're not going to have somebody looking at you saying, Black people weren't all slaves, in the 19th century.
But, and then with the rise of independent publishing, those young Black women who refused to be turned away and went out there and learned how to do formatting and learned how to upload their stuff and learned how to do marketing, have changed publishing forever. Yeah. So even if you are rejected, you can still publish that book through self-publishing. And there's a lot of that on Jane Friedman's site too, on how to do that. So you got choices that we didn't have growing up. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say thank you for that great advice. You're right. I think, one thing you said that's so key is you got to do the work.
You got to do the work.
You got to do the work. And all the people that say they have a book inside of them, okay, you got to get the book outside of you. It doesn't do anybody any good if it stays inside of you. Thank you so much, Beverly. Again, your new book is Wild Rain. I have my copy. Make sure you get yours. It's available everywhere. Books are so. You will not put this book down. It is, riveting. You're on the edge of your seat. You want to turn every page. The two characters are. Whew. I'm gonna leave it there.
And you learn stuff. And you learn stuff too. So it's not all about the sex. So
yeah, the sex is good, but the history's better. All right, we'll leave it at that. Thank you again, Beverly.
Thank you so much for having me. You have a great day. Okay.
All right.
All right. Bye-bye.
My next guest is Zetta Elliott. She is an award-winning Black feminist poet, essayist, novelist, and writer of stories for children. She was born in Canada, but has lived in the U.S. for the last 25 years. Welcome, Zetta. You have such an incredible portfolio of books, including Dragons in a Bag, The Drago Thief, Say Her Name, Milo Museum, and your latest book, A Place Inside of Me. This book, what I've read, marks your 38th children's book. I say that number and I'm like, okay, that is just a huge number. Did I get it right? Is this number 38 for you?
You did. I'm so impressed. Usually I can't even keep straight the numbers. So yes, it is number 38.
Well, I'll tell you this quick story. When I was doing my research, the interview, I saw 20, I saw 25, and I kept digging, and then I saw 38. I said, this must be it. I said, I'm going to land on this. That's really, really incredible. Then I read that this book was really a poem that you wrote in 2001. Why didn't it get published for almost, 20 years? What took so long?
Oh my goodness, there are so many barriers for writers of color and especially for Black writers in the publishing industry. So when I first started writing for kids, I never intended to be a children's book author. I started out writing for adults and couldn't get that book, couldn't get it placed with an agent or an editor, but I've worked with kids for 30 years. And I was teaching them how to write children's picture books. And so I made a couple of examples and they loved them. And next thing I knew, I had written 20 stories.
Wow.
So then I got there used to be something called the Children's Writers Market. And it was a book that was as big as a phone book. And I went through it and studied it. And here's how you write a query letter. And here's how you find an agent. And here's the publishers that accept unagented submissions, right? There are all these rules because it's a system. Right. And I figured out all the rules and I followed all the rules and I could not get anything published. And I just didn't understand what was happening and sort of moved away from writing for kids. And then Hurricane Katrina hit. I was living in Baton Rouge at the time, and crisis sort of activates my imagination. And I started sending out all of these stories that had been sitting on my hard drive. And one of them was Bird, and it won a contest. And then we won a whole bunch of awards. And I thought, oh, yes, I've won all these awards. And now I have 20 other stories on my hard drive. It'll be no problem. And I just couldn't place anything. It was extremely frustrating. So then I sort of used my applied my training to the publishing industry to figure out what was going wrong, and then understood that it was a system and that there's a particular culture, and that makes it especially hard for Black writers to break in. So I persisted as we do and finally got it placed.
Well, thank goodness for your tenacity. Let's talk a little about that book, Bird, before we go back to your 38th book. I think we have the illustration of that book, Bird. You said it won a bunch of awards. And did that breakthrough, I'll call it a breakthrough, getting that book published after sending out so many stories and then it winning awards, did that give you that, that encouragement to keep going? Because by then you were 20 stories in. Now you're 38, stories later. I found that really interesting, though, with respect to your latest book, the dedication.
Yeah.
The dedication to Zion.
Right.
And Zion is the nephew of Atiana Jefferson. Why that dedication?
So I think the reason it was possible for me to keep going after Bird was published and won so many awards, and then I couldn't place anything else, is that you have to remember why you're doing what you're doing. I'm sure this applies to every arena, but for me, especially writing books for kids, you have to have your own definition of success. And so when I looked at my picture book and it had all these stickers on it, and I thought, well, if I never win any more awards, would I keep writing? And the answer is yes. And if I never got that 6-figure deal and a film deal, would I keep writing? And the answer is yes. Because when I published Bird, I had never talked to anybody publicly about what happened in my family, my brother's struggle with addiction, his incarceration. Even most of my close friends didn't know about it. And then I wrote this book based on that experience, and suddenly people everywhere were sending me emails or coming up to me and saying, thank you, that happened in my family too. And I realized that there are so many things within our communities, within our culture, that just don't get talked about really, and especially with children. And when you're a child, if you're growing up in a family where children should be seen and not heard, or even just parents who want to be protective, right? Black parents are working so hard to protect their kids that we often don't talk about things that are actually really important. And so trauma, that was the focus of my dissertation. So writing about it for children is important to me. I had a book come out earlier last year, Say Her Name, and I'm really invested in making sure that Black women are recognized as equal victims of police brutality and other forms of oppression. So when writing A Place Inside of Me, the Black Lives Matter movement wasn't officially underway in 2001, but it's still so relevant because we've been dealing with these issues forever, right? Basically since we got here. So to have a book where a child could see themselves in the pictures, could see themselves in the narrative, being allowed to honor all of their emotions. I think we get so afraid of discussing certain topics because we're afraid they're too sad. And I get that in my rejection letters very often. What a beautiful story, Zetta, but it's just too sad. And it's like, too sad for whom? Which kids are you worried about? Because the kids who have lost someone to gun violence, to police violence, they need this book, right? And then the kids that haven't, they need it too, because they need to look through the window and see someone else's experience. There isn't just sadness. There isn't just trauma or anger even. There's compassion and hope and joy, right? We started with joy. So that book was really important to me, and to recognize that Zion is the nephew of a Tatiana Jefferson who was there when his aunt was murdered by police, for him to know that he's not alone, and there are so many other kids out there who miss the person whose hand they used to hold, and healing is possible. That's the focus of that book. It's about healing.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that about, different demographics of kids. Kids, African American, Latino kids that live in, certain communities throughout this country. That trauma is real. So not talking about it doesn't make it go away. And having some place to, to express those feelings and to be able to do it through a book, through, written word, through images, I think is so important. And so thank you for recognizing that, Zion was there. He was playing with a video game when,
right.
Police shot his aunt. So
right.
That's not going to go away. That's something he's going to carry with him for the rest of his life. And he's not alone. So many African-American kids have seen gun violence, whether it's, the videos that they've watched on television or in their own communities. So being able to have some place to express that, I think is so incredibly important. So thank you. And you're right. The kids that don't live in those neighborhoods need to be sensitized to it, because they're going to grow up to be future leaders, future legislators, future policymakers, and they need to understand what's happening to other kids that are their same ages, but have such different experiences. So I think that's why I was just drawn to that book. I was so incredibly impressed. And I know you didn't win the Caldecott Award for it, but your illustrator did. And I was just so happy for that. And I read that this year, 2021, all of the winners were women, and all women of color. And as I said before, the interview,
first time ever.
First time ever. Like, all these BIPOC women
right.
winning this prestigious book award.
It's about time.
Let's talk about that time. I know you describe yourself as a Black feminist, and that term, feminist, has taken on lots of connotations, definitions over the last, I'd say particularly the last decade, when you have women like Beyonce and, Cardi B declaring themselves as feminists. But what does it mean for you when you talk about being a Black feminist writer?
Well, to be a Black feminist is to see the world through a particular lens. And I think for many of us, we have a perspective before we have the language for it. So, I think growing up in a patriarchal family, growing up being raised by a single mother who favored my brother, understanding that I was always going to have to work a little bit harder, even if it was literally to get a slice of pie at home, or if it was to get, the attention of my teachers at school, or if it was to get the job that I wanted. It didn't take long. As a teenager, I understood what was going on. And then I discovered Black feminist writers. My last semester of my last year of college, I had my first Black educator in my life, a Black man named Jerry Tucker, and he introduced me to Jamaica Kincaid's writing. And to suddenly have a woman whose experience was so similar to mine, to be reading her analysis of the British colonization of the Caribbean and my father's Caribbean. So understanding my father more by reading the words of Black women. A lot of people think feminism is just about, like, it's a private club for women. And that's absolutely not what it is at all, right? Like, if we had more men, if people of all genders were willing to embrace a vision of the world where we had equity and equality, and we weren't focused on dominance and superiority. I mean, we look at the violence against women right now, not just in this country, the horrific shooting in Atlanta that left 6 Asian women dead, the situation around the world. I mean, this is something that women everywhere are grappling with, and patriarchy isn't good for men.
No.
When I started studying slavery in graduate school, and you hear Frederick Douglass talking about how enslavement damaged the enslaver as much as it damaged the enslaved, patriarchy is the exact same way. It limits men in so many ways. They're unable to express their emotions. A place inside of me, it was important to me to have a boy in the book. Noah's initial sketches were to have a little girl. And I said, I really want it to be a boy, and he's an older boy, and he's kind of independent. He's out there on his skateboard. But, if we're constantly telling boys, you can't cry, you can't be sad, you can't be vulnerable, you can't be kind to others, and then you end up with a kid who's frustrated and has access to a gun, and where does he turn it? He turns it on the people he thinks are subordinate to him, and he's been taught through patriarchy that that's women. So Black feminism is about having an intersectional approach, which says, I'm not Black in one moment and feminist or a woman in another. I am constantly seeking the liberation of all people, because if, as many other Black feminists have said, if Black women were free, everybody would be free.
No, absolutely. And I'm so glad you said that about men. I'm actually writing a book that comes out in August about women in leadership and the lies that women have been told. And one of them is that women alone can, shatter the glass ceiling, that we can break down these patriarchal structures and systems, that relegate women to second-class citizens by doing it ourselves. And we can, march our way through this. And that's one of the myths that I debunk in my book. And I talk about the importance of partnerships and allyships with males, that, women can, we can crack the ceiling, but to shatter that ceiling, we need men working alongside us. And so I'm glad to hear that my views are shared by you and other Black feminists. I do want to talk about, though, you said that being a Black feminist, as much as you embrace it, has not been valued or embraced in the kids' literary world. That you are kind of, you've been accused of being the writer that doesn't play nice.
Well, everyone has a different definition of feminism and of activism, right? And there are plenty of different ways of being Black in the world. So people have different approaches. I think I'm considered a radical. I don't think my views are necessarily that radical, but you have to be willing to give something up. And I think if you're not willing to rock the boat, if you simply accept that there is a system, and this is what I often hear from other activists of color within the children's literature community, is they'll say, it's an industry, it's, the publishers are trying to make money, so we have to make sure these books sell, they make money. And putting money at the center of your creative mission, I think, is just a mistake. And obviously we live in a capitalist society. I depend on people buying my books, and I depend on contracts and all that sort of thing. But you know what? We come from a cultures, plural, we come from communities where stories weren't commodities. right? Our culture, African culture, West African culture, stories are there to connect communities, to connect generations, to pass down knowledge, to teach our values. We have these storytelling traditions that matter, and they matter whether or not our books sell and make a whole lot of money. And I think if you put money first, then you've got a problem. You've got it backwards, in fact, and then you start catering to the market. And I see a number of books that make it to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. And if they are at the top of the New York Times bestseller list, it's generally because white people are buying them. And if you are writing to please that market, you might be doing something wrong, right? Like, I'm not going to get into Hamilton, but when you have something that is hugely popular, even with white conservatives, you are definitely doing something wrong, because they shouldn't be comfortable with our stories. Our stories should make people uncomfortable in some ways if you are addressing injustice and inequality. And not everybody's doing that in their books, and that's fine if you don't want to. But to say that the system is fine and the system works because, look at, and then they'll point to the same three people over and over again, the clique is doing very well, but that doesn't mean that the system is serving everyone. And maybe we should talk about alternatives to the system. But when you do try to work outside of the system, as I do through self-publishing many of my books, then you're penalized for that, because the system can't allow there to be that kind of competition, that kind of independence, which is what you are, an indie author.
Yeah, and I found it interesting, speaking of books being bought, making it to the New York Times bestsellers list, and who's buying the books, that I guess you talk about in 2014, 2015, there being a spike in books about Blacks, but they weren't written by Black authors. I was shocked by that statistic, that white authors are writing books about Black kids, or writing in the kids literature genre about Black experiences and Black stories, but they're Black authors like yourself can't break through. What's that about?
Well, obviously,
power. Money.
It's about power. Yeah. So people say it's about money, but it's really not, because if publishers put money into promoting Black authored books, Black people have $1 trillion in spending power. If Black people knew how many books were out there for kids, but the publishers won't market to them. Frito-Lay and Ford Motor Company, McDonald's, everybody has this sort of niche marketing, and they know how to target certain communities. And the publishing industry refuses to do that because they don't have anyone on their marketing teams who could. They'd have to hire consultants, outside consultants, to do that kind of work. So they would walk away from money. They would leave money on the table in order to hold on to what matters most to them. And in my opinion, that's power. They want to be able to control. They're gatekeepers, right? They get to say, you don't tell that story, you tell that story, even though you're an outsider. That might be your experience, but you're not the expert. We're going to bring in this expert over here. So at the time I wrote that, I think we were at a third of books about Black people for kids were written by Black people, and now we're up to maybe 40%. Carol Boston Weatherford is a fantastic African-American nonfiction author. She just wrote a great essay for Hornbook, and she's talking about the exact same thing, that she's sending out these biographies of important Black people, and she's being told, oh, I don't know who that is, or we already have a book like that published by a white author. So, it's really difficult for Black authors, kidlit creators, to compete in a market where the people making the decisions to greenlight projects don't look like you, don't come from your community, and don't understand your priorities or your storytelling traditions. That's, I think, the biggest challenge.
Yeah, that's interesting that you said that the industry is more interested in propping up those authors who they deem, the experts or the people that, they want to work with, they have relationships with, nepotism. We can think of a gazillion different reasons, but they give those stories, they'll allow that white author to tell the same story that clearly could be told with a level of authenticity by a Black author that white author, no matter how successful they may be in terms of book sales, could never duplicate. I'm glad to hear you say we went from a third of authors telling, Black authors telling those stories to 40%. Obviously, that means we still have a lot of work to do, and a lot of ground to cover, but at least we're making some progress. What do you think is, I mean, obviously having women like you, having women like Cosby, being recognized, and you've self-published, but you also have had, a number of books published by traditional mainstream publishers. Mm-hmm. Are you finding now that those same publishers are more willing to take a look at your stories, or are they more willing to say those stories, they're not as dark, they're not as, unpopular as maybe they thought 10 years ago or so?
I wish I could say that things have changed dramatically for me, but they haven't, unfortunately. So my most successful series right now is with Random House. That's Dragons in a Bag and The Dragon Thief. I think we're at 100,000 copies sold at this point, and we have an option for the film. And we went to the publisher and, said, it's a 5-book series. Do you want book 3? And they said no. They said no. So it's that same situation with Bird. Like, even when you're doing everything right, even when you think you're playing by the rules, it still doesn't work out. And it's only until we have...
Wait a minute. Is it no because the book didn't sell enough? Is it no?
They could say that because it was selling.
Not popular? Like,
just no. Just no. We're not interested in continuing the series. So until we had the protests last year, until Black Lives Matter activists were out there in the streets marching, and then corporations started issuing statements, including a lot of publishers, to say, we know we can do better. Then they came back and said, well, we're interested in book 3. And then they made an offer that was so offensively low. And it was the week after the hashtag publishing paid me came out. I'm sure you know about that, where it revealed, authors of color, especially Black authors like Roxane Gay and Jesmyn Ward, were getting paid $25,000 when debut white authors were getting six-figure deals. They came back with an offer that was so offensive that I just said to my agent, we're done, we're walking away. And it was only until after we said we're walking away, that they came back and said, wait, what have we done? We don't understand. And I wrote a letter and said, here are all the things you've done wrong. And it went up the chain. And then we got back into negotiations.
Okay, so you got to tell me this story has a happy ending. Okay.
Well, there are five books in the series, and they asked for book 3. And I said, well, what about the other books? And they said, we'll take book 3 and 4. And they did not commit to book 5. So we have...
Okay, but there's a deal, an acceptable deal that badass Zetta negotiated for 3 and 4.
For 3 and 4.
Hearing, right? Okay, so the Dragon series will continue with Random House, one of the largest publishing, companies in the nation, in the world, globally.
Right.
Wow. I'm so happy. You know why I'm happy to hear that? Because I was on such a tear with all of those statements. I was pulling my hair out, going absolutely apeshit crazy over statement after statement after statement. As a civil rights lawyer, I've been here before, and I'm like, lovely, 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 wonderful. But what is happening, behind those statements internally? And you're revealing that, yes, there was an offer, but it was a poor offer. It was a discriminatory offer. It wasn't an offer that reflected, the quality of who you are as an author, the success that you've had, that match what I won't even call them your white counterparts, because you're 38 books in. So we're not even, no, really, they're not even apples to apples, and that's the unfair comparison that often gets made. But yeah. I'm glad you stood your ground and you walked away from that deal rather than allowing them to exploit you. And let's just call it what it is. It's exploitation. It's to be able to check a box and to say, yeah, we signed Zetta Elliott for her 3rd book, and nobody knowing, of course, the crappy deal that they offered.
Right behind it. Yeah.
You went back and you pushed. And that's how change happens. Really, right? That's how it happens.
I think about Nina Simone all the time.
Okay, we'll walk away from the table.
There you go. You've got to learn to leave the table when love's no longer being served. Because I know my agent was like, look, we just have to fight. And I was like, we shouldn't have to fight. They should want me. They should want these books. They're making money off of these books, right? That idea that, well, you have to prove that a book can sell. And then a book sells 100,000 copies and they still don't want to support the series. It really isn't about money, but you do have to have that sense of your own worth. And I think that's really hard in this industry, because you're meant to be grateful for every little crumb, right? You're supposed to be grateful. And if you walk away, then you're ungrateful. And then you get a reputation. And like the Lord knows I already have a reputation in this industry. But you have to be able to say that. And because I self-published, I could say, well, if you don't want those books, I will make them myself.
Yeah, and let me just give my audience some perspective. The average book on the shelf is lucky to sell 10 to 15,000 copies. I mean, that's a successful book. 15,000 copies, and I'm a 3-time published author, so a 15,000 book run is successful. So a 100,000 book run is uber successful. So we're not talking Michelle Obama, Barack Obama. Those are outliers. Those are, unusual books, and the publishing companies make a ton of money on those books, but they come along, once a year, and not for every publisher. But the average publisher, if they can get a book that sells 100,000 copies, that is hugely successful. So there shouldn't even been any question about you as an author. You sold 100,000 books. That's, that puts you in a unique class of authors. Not very many people can say that. Wow.
Yeah. So it's a nice confidence booster for me. It reaffirms that I'm telling the right kinds of stories, that I don't have to think of an algorithm or a formula to make it onto the New York Times bestseller list, because I'm not there and probably won't ever be. I don't write those kinds of stories. But that is my definition of success, to be able to write what I want, when I want, how I want it, to be able to connect with the kids that I feel I ought to be serving. The third book, The Witch's Apprentice, is set here in Chicago. So it was super exciting to be able to go around Chicago and work in some Black history and some landmarks and things that hopefully will make Chicago kids excited. So
wow. So I know you have your own imprint, Zetta Press, where you are going to generate these culturally relevant stories that center around children who've been marginalized in our society. So any projects coming up through your imprint?
Wow. So I do still have 20 picture book manuscripts on my hard drive. And we have sold a couple of them to traditional publishers. So last year I self-published a book for younger kids called On My Block, which is set in Philadelphia. It's a rhyming picture book. And then I was living in central Pennsylvania, and I have family roots in Pennsylvania. I grew up hearing my grandmother talk about Bishop Richard Allen, the founder of the AME Church. And so I connected with the Bethel AME in Lancaster and started learning more about the history of Blacks in central Pennsylvania, and published a picture book called Roots Run Deep, sort of as a tribute to my grandmother, talking about, because, when I was a kid, I didn't understand. I had books about slavery, but I didn't understand what our culture was before enslavement, right? So to start in West Africa and say, we were scholars, we were warriors, we were artisans, and that's why they came to get us. They wanted skilled workers, so to tell the history of the transatlantic slave trade with a more comprehensive and African-centered viewpoint, that was really important to me. I have, some animal stories that, that's another thing, is that Black authors are only allowed to publish in certain genres. So publishers actually a few years ago doubled the number of books they were publishing about animals, because they think animals are race neutral, which they are not. But a Black author writing animal stories has a very hard time getting it published. It seems to be the domain of white men. So I have a couple of animal stories that I would love to get into folks' hands. But coming up next will be a Juneteenth picture book. And then I have a couple of middle grade novels coming up too. So yeah.
So you're busy. I'm glad you are, defying the stereotypes about the stories that Black authors can tell. We know that, white children can go to the bookshelves, they can go to the library, and they don't have to worry about if they're going to see books, with characters that look like them. It's automatic. Of course they will. And we know that oftentimes African-American kids, children of color, have to search, have to ask. And in some bookstores, unfortunately, they're in a separate section for kids of color, which, shouldn't be the case. And, in this moment where we're talking about anti-racism and we're talking about, breaking down systemic racism, simple things, they're not even simple, but things like being able to pick up a book in a bookstore and not worry about whether you're going to see someone that looks like you reflected in that book are so important. And the only way we get there is with authors like you, who are willing to push the envelope and keep telling those stories. And I just want to thank you so much, Zetta, for the work that you're doing. Amazing. Writing so many, 38 books. I'm sure the next time we talk, it'll be like 58 or something incredible. You seem like you're on a roll and you just got all of this, creativity that's just oozing out of you. And really this moment, I create such a backdrop for, creatives like yourself. Again, your book, A Place Inside of Me, your latest book, your 38th book. We want to make sure we promote that book. We want to make sure you keep, hitting those 100,000 plus marks, because that is, unfortunately, today, one way that authors like you will continue to get published by mainstream publishing houses. So you're really living like the dream, because you're publishing with mainstream publishing houses and you are still self-publishing under your own imprint. And
I'm doing it.
That freedom. So I know a lot of authors would just, love to be in your shoes. So you're inspiring a lot of people in our stories, Black women, the keepers of our stories. So again, thank you so much for sitting down with me this morning.
Thank you for having me and for giving a platform for children's literature. It's not always included in conversations, but it's so important. These are the seeds we sow.
Absolutely. Well, as the mother of 3 kids, I've bought a ton of children's books, and I know how important it is. And I'll say this, one of my daughters now is like the most avid reader ever. This girl can read, like Harry Potter, 900-page books.
Good for her.
2 days, 3 days. She's read Barack Obama's book. And that thing is like 900 pages. And she said, Mom, when are you going to read the book? Mom, when are you going to read? I'm like, I'm going to read the book on a plane, on a trip. But that's what reading, starting out early on with kids, that's what happens, when they get to be young adults and teenagers, is that if they start off reading amazing, children's books, they become adult readers.
Absolutely. You have to feed your imagination, because our kids, they're the ones who are going to have the vision of the future that we really crave and that we need. So feeding their imagination at a young age is so key. Books in the home, kids stay in school longer, they do better in school. You raised a reader. Congratulations.
I did. Shout out Michael Martin. Michael is a serious reader. I literally, we'd stand in those lines when she was a Harry Potter fan. When they would do the big drop, you'd go to a bookstore and camp out overnight. We were in those lines, and I actually I was reminding a friend that I got so hooked on Harry Potter myself, I would be in court with a book in my briefcase. Like, okay, I need this case to end because I got to get I got to get back to Harry Potter. So. I love reading, and so I'm fortunate my kids, both of them, Morgan is a reader too, but Michael is just like in another stratosphere with her reading.
Awesome.
But again, thank you so much, Zetta. I enjoyed talking with you.
Thanks, Areva. Take care.
Bye. Thanks to Beverly Jenkins and Zetta Elliott for giving us Black Girl Magic vibes all morning. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. I hope my aspiring writers were inspired by the storytelling of these amazing authors. Some words to live by before I get out. Iconic 20th century writer and poet Langston Hughes had this to say: "It is the duty of the younger Negro artist to change through the force of his art that old whispering, 'I want to be white,' hidden in the aspirations of his people to, 'Why should I be white? I am Negro and beautiful.'" I'm out, y'all. Be safe out there. Don't forget to wear your mask, and don't forget, we are all in this together.